My research shows that 70% of Americans actually believe they have more in common than not, and that even though they disagree, there's broad consensus on a couple of major themes and why we're a great country. Now, the fringes, well, they're not so small. I mean, the 15% extremes on each end don't agree with that. But the problem is why this is a paradox is because the 70% feels like they're in the minority because the extremes are so loud. So it's the extremes who have the gavel, and it makes it feel like there isn't an actual majority who really want us to heal. Now, I will say this, and I talk about this in the book, as you probably have noted, the media models that we've gravitated towards exacerbate this problem, because since everything in media is now based on advertising, our journalistic traditions have gotten bastardized. And I think that's also what sells eyeballs, or what gets eyeballs and clicks, as you know, is sensationalism. So similarly, it's ironic, the extremes have the gavel and affect our political leaders, but the news media, news quote unquote, enforces it.
Exactly. And that's it. The exact point I wanted to make is I think one of the main problems here is incentive structures, because you talk about the frustrated majority, the vocal minority, all of these things I think are attributed to the rise of social media. And social media really gives a platform to the fringes. And because of the incentive structures of social media and the mainstream media, like you said, sensationalism. The people who get all of the clicks and all of the attention are the ones with the most radical views, the most polarizing views. The news that gets the most attention is the most divisive. So what do you think about the problem of incentive structures?
Well, a lot of these problems are rooted, if you will, in incentives, poor incentives or misaligned incentives issue. So let's talk about that for a second. I think there are fundamentally two actors in the political landscape, if you will, that have horrible incentives today. And that's by the way, in the third part of the book, I lay out a plan to fix us, to heal us, and it's largely about uh, changing our mindset on one hand, but also changing these incentives. So that is you're onto the path of the solution when we get there. But let's talk about what are the incentives that are misaligned. There's two big areas. The first is elected officials themselves. I think have realized for the last couple of decades that what motivates voters to get to the polls is not rational economic issues all the time, but often what used to be called wedge issues, issues that push their buttons, that get them either angry, scared, that trigger emotions. I call it sometimes, the amygdala response. It's the part of our lizard brains where so politicians started learning this and realizing that details of problem solving are kind of boring. It doesn't get people motivated. Whereas, when I was a kid, economic kitchen table issues really dominated the discussion. Now, I think economic issues are still part of what we talk about, but I do think that the tactic, or if you will, the strategy for getting elected is about who can push the buttons the best, who can stoke fear or anger, and those are the people who figure out how to win elections, and that's a bad incentive structure. Now, when you break that down, this whole thing, you see, I can use some concrete examples. We have guidelines. They're not even constitutional laws. Each state makes up rules for how to conduct elections. So when you have gerrymandered districts to a huge degree, then they become less competitive. So let's take an example, because I really want your listeners to understand what I mean by bad incentives. Let's take like a district like Kentucky 8. Let's say it's a safe red district. 85% of our districts are safe. So let's say you have a right of center conservative Republican woman in that district. I'm making this up, but it's for illustrative purposes. And in her term, she is pretty conservative, but she does work collaboratively with some Democrats to get a bill launched, to get something done. In the next round, when the primary happens, first of all, it's closed primaries. So a third of the voters in the state are independents. They can't vote. So what counts is the Republican primary in this case. And this happens, by the way, both on Republican and Democratic side. So I could use the same example with AOC or something else. So what happens is this reasonable Congresswoman who's a Republican will get primaried because the people that show up and vote in the Republican primary are they're committed, often extreme voters. It's a slice of the electorate. So let me share with you this how bad this incentive structure has gotten. We and this is research shows that in the U.S. around 8% of the electorate of the voters elect 85% of our Congress people. That's that few. It's gotten down to a very small slice because the primaries are what count, and very few people vote in the primaries. So this is a bad incentive. Now, fixing this is both there's a good news and bad news story. The good news is that it's none of this is in the Constitution. These are all guidelines that are adopted state by state. So it's things like open primaries or ranked choice voting or districting more fairly. All those are things feeding these incentives, and none of them are specified by any federal law. So that's the good news. They can all change. The bad news is that they have to change at the state level. The federal government's not going to fix this. This requires doing what Alaska's done and what other states are doing and saying, you know what, we're going to appoint a nonpartisan commission to redraw our districts and make them competitive and get races where we have more ideas, etc. So that's very much, I'm jumping forward a bit. That's the work that I do nowadays on changing those incentives in the electoral field. Okay. So before I go in more detail, I mentioned there were two areas. So electoral politics is one where the incentives are bad. The other area we touched on briefly is the media. So the media is driven by sensationalism because advertising is all that matters. Now, ironically, Jake, we talked before, so the incentives are bad. It's about getting clicks, not about pursuing truth. Now, this is particularly ironic because we've seen this movie before. We went through this in this country. In the 19th century, information was becoming more and more sensationalized by what we now call yellow journalism. There was newspapers all over the country writing things that were not based in truth, that were sensationalizing. And as a response to that, in the 1920s and 30s, we started cultivating and building a journalistic profession. There were journalism schools, there were, unions started, press associations started, where an ethic of journalism became solidified around what it means journalistically to pursue truth and verify sources. And it became a profession like medicine and law. It was very highly regarded. And that whole trend of developing that profession was in response to sensational reporting, where it was hard to get the truth. So doesn't it feel like we've come full circle? We're kind of what happened to the journalistic integrity? And I can talk more about what broke that down if you want to get into it. But just to summarize, the two incentive areas that are really misaligned today in terms of helping us solve civic issues are the way we elect officials and the way we run media.
No, 100%. It's so complicated because it runs so deep. These institutions are so entrenched. It's like how do we how do we bring about change? Because when it comes to electing officials, the people who are required to make reform and create new laws and new reforms are the people who hold the power because of the incentive structures of the elections.
Absolutely right. So we recognize now that we have sometimes we call this the fox in the hen house, fox guarding the hen house problem. So the people who have gerrymandered the districts in many states, those are the state legislatures who hold the power to change the laws. So this is only going to change, and this is one of the wonderful things about history when you watch how waves of change happen if the voters demand it. And that's what's happening, Jake. It's not, people aren't so aware of this, but look at Alaska, which has moved towards a ranked choice final five voting system. They have a much more bipartisan local Senate and House. Um, they're really solving problems. There are other states that have taken this on. In Michigan, which was very gerrymandered, there was a bipartisan commission that suggested a new approach to drawing districts much more fairly. And they kind of because there were business people on this, and they forced the local legislature to adopt it. So often you're right. You have a problem here of the people who have the incentives to do this are the ones holding power, and they don't want to change. But little by little that we're eroding that. Many like for example, I could go into more detail, but ranked choice voting is an effective way of taking out some of this incentive. And just in a nutshell, what people think looks complicated. What ranked choice voting does is it makes the candidates that run different, because the candidates that run are required to appeal to more voters. In other words, it's because what counts is not only being in first place, but being second and third. So in ranked choice voting, you've got to appeal to more constituents. And therefore, different types of problem solvers end up running for elections. So it changes who's attracted to be a political service official. And so it's a powerful mechanism, and it's actually not that complicated. Um, which we can get into. So that's one example. But open primaries is another. Redistricting. I think the hardest one of the reforms that I work on and advocate in the book, the hardest one to tackle is the effect of money in politics. Because that is now constitutional based on various Supreme Court rulings. So we need probably an amendment, which is, of course, very hard to really fix that. But I think it's gotten to the point where we're in a wonderful economy, even though at times it's been lagging. But overall, if you look over the long haul, we've had tremendous prosperity in this country, and our model of economic capitalism has been very successful. But we're at a point where we're letting the participants in the games write all the rules. It's like I just came back from the Olympics. Imagine if, like, the athletes didn't have to follow the rules to compete. I mean, the beauty of capitalism is we get innovation and we get new technologies and new solutions because people compete in markets. I mean, that's the whole premise of Adam Smith and the Invisible Hand. And I think we've moved away from that in certain ways. So that's another area where I think we need probably to readjust, because we do want a flourishing economy. It is the root of so much prosperity, but we've gotten into a situation where moneyed interests are really affecting politics in a big way.
Exactly. In my opinion, that's the biggest problem is campaign finance policy, because what is it? It's quid pro quo, I think, is like the term for it. Um, you have these corporate interests who are financing campaigns just to get the legislation that's beneficial to them. I'm watching House of Cards right now, which a lot of people have said is like the most accurate portrayal of what politics is really like behind the scenes. And seeing how corporate interests dominate legislation is kind of appalling in a way. And it's how are you going to serve the American people when you have to be beholden towards your investors?
Absolutely. So this is a very interesting problem, and again, it's one I tackle in the third part of the book. But we in this country have a wonderful tradition of free speech. It's in our First Amendment, and through various decision making and hypothesizing and derivative ideas, we've come to call corporations people. And this corporate structure itself is a structural concept that helps manage liability and taxes. It's not a I don't think the Constitution, in my opinion, doesn't protect corporate speech. So that there's like some things that I think it presents the First Amendment is about individual citizens' right to speech. Now, that's one. Even there are balances to the different freedoms. So, for example, let me give an example. I ran a very big company in the skincare space. We would run maybe $2 to $3 million of advertising every week on TV, in the radio, on the internet. We were selling a leading acne product called Proactive. And there you go. So my point is this: we did all this media, and every piece of advertising needed to be approved by two federal watchdogs. The FDA, because we couldn't make fake acne claims, we had to abide by that. And the FTC, we couldn't make deceiving marketing claims. Now, those are set up because they're to protect the public from. So it's a limit on our speech as a company. Well, all I'm saying is there are many industries where there's tremendous restrictions on what you can say if it's going to hurt consumers. Now, because political speech is the most protected, we don't regulate campaign advertising at all, so people can say whatever they want, and that's a problem. So I, like some people have said that this my one suggestion that I go into detail and I've written about is tongue in cheek. What I suggest is that until we figure out how to better manage this, we should ban political advertising in TV on the internet, and only we should allow political campaigns to advertise in print, make people read their argument in 100 words or less. In other words, if it's so easy to deceive in medias that we won't regulate because we have a free speech, then we have to not advertise there. That we don't sell cigarettes online. It's too. You don't have advertising for cigarettes because it's banned. Political speech has become so divisive and misinformed that it's hurting us. So there are other ways to do this. There's federal funding of elections. What I would say, Jake, is that if you look across some of our European counterparts, they've tackled this better than we have. And I'm not saying it's an easy problem. I think you're astute to say that it's one of the core issues here. It is. But it also is something that needs to be addressed, and I believe we can address it. There's a group I work with called American Promise, and their entire raison d'etre as a group, and they're, by the way, bipartisan. They're a lot of conservatives, a lot of Democrats, a lot of Republicans. Their whole goal is to pass a one-paragraph amendment to the Constitution that bars dark money from politics. And so it's very simple. Now, their strategy for doing it is by being bipartisan and creating a movement that is both traditionally, people right and left and center. And they're working at getting this particular amendment pre-ratified, and they have, I think, 12 states on board. So who knows? I mean, maybe we will get to an amendment. That's what they're working on. I think they're a wonderful organization. But there are also other things that are happening to help mitigate the problem of moneyed interest controlling politics.
Hopefully, I tend to be more of an optimist when with my outlook. I have hope that people will bring about reform, because step one is awareness. And I think we're past that. Many people are aware of the issues, and like you said, you have foundations like that who are starting to raise their voices about this.